Hey retro gamers. Today on Smashing Bricks, we take a leap into the third dimension and don the tunic of the hero of time in the Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time. Hey, welcome back to Smashing Bricks, a retro gaming podcast. This is episode 23. My name is Eddie Inzauto, and today I'm joined by James Carter of the amazing and 12 years running Cane and Rinse podcast. Hello, sir. How are you doing today? Long time no chat.
Yeah, it's been a while. I am doing really well, thank you. How are you?
Wonderful. Wonderful, and I'm super excited to get to talk about this very special game from gaming history, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Now, the last time we were on a podcast together, I believe, was 10 years ago in 2013 when we talked about Fahrenheit on Cane and Rinse. Is that right?
That sounds about right. I can't think that we'd have appeared together on anything else in the interim, but yeah, what a game to have taken a pause on our podcasting relationship. Fahrenheit.
Yeah. What a long time. But since then, you have podcasted on that show for 10 years.
Yeah.
Now, since you are new to this show, though, there's something I like to do with my guests, which you don't see on the outline that I sent you because I didn't put it. But I like to let our listeners get to know the guest and get to know your tastes so that they could understand where you're coming from with your opinions, at least a little bit.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you a few questions to start, and I just want you to answer them rapid fire. You don't have to put too much thought into them. Just, answer from the heart, from the gut. Okay, so what's your favorite game genre?
So I heard James Batchelor on this say stealth, and I thought 10 years ago I'd have absolutely said stealth. And then I started thinking, well, if stealth can be a genre, then I'm not even sure it's a genre, but exploration is my favorite thing to do in games. So any game that allows me to explore a physical space is absolutely right up there.
What a great answer.
I'm just creating a new genre, all of its
I like it. Well, genre, it's a fluid concept, right?
For sure, yeah.
Are we talking mechanical genre, thematic genre?
Absolutely.
That's a great answer. I appreciate that because I agree with you about exploration and discovery myself.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite things to do too. Okay. With that in mind, who's your favorite developer and or publisher and why?
I mean, it's the most tired answer I could possibly give, but it is From Software.
Ooh.
There's no way around it, I'm afraid. In the 10 years since we last podcasted, and even for a couple before that, every time one of their games comes out, it's just drop everything, play this, probably for like a couple of months solid, playing it through multiple times on different platforms. And yeah, their games, whenever they come out, more or less end up at the top of my most enjoyed experiences for each and every year.
Amazing. I believe Elden Ring is the greatest game ever made, and the Dark Souls series are my top 4 or 5 games there are.
Yeah.
And interestingly, we've already gotten to the point where in just a couple of months, Demon Souls will be old enough to be on this retro gaming podcast.
Yeah.
How's that make you feel?
It's scary. It really is. I mean, yeah, I remember the years of Demon Souls being back-to-back Game of the Year winners due to it coming out a year later in the West.
On
on
Big Red
on
Potion.
Big Red Potion, absolutely. And at the moment I heard it for the second year be the game of the year, I was just like, right, let's just get this into my PlayStation 3 right now and start playing it. So
Oh, we sent you to the game.
absolutely, yeah, for sure,
Amazing.
yeah,
Well, you're welcome because I was instrumental in picking it that second year.
yeah,
I
absolutely.
cheated and made it happen.
It's one of those where it shouldn't happen, but there's a technicality, so let's have it happen. Why not?
Yes. Okay. Some rapid fire console wars. We'll start with PC versus console generally.
Console now, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now going back to 16-bit, Super Nintendo versus Genesis. I mean Mega Drive.
So Super Nintendo was the first home console I owned, and right up until I was not playing games for a while, I transitioned to playing PC. But it is the definitive home console for me. It's the one I think back to. It's the one I remember sort of bashing elbows with friends over. My TV that I had the Super Nintendo hooked up to had a crack along the top from when I was playing Street Fighter 2 on it, and got frustrated and used to bang the top of the TV back in the days
Oh
where
my
that wouldn't
God.
actually break the TV because it was just this hunk of glass inside that wasn't going to get damaged. Yeah, it had a small hairline crack along the plastic. I don't want to make out that I was throwing TVs around the room. It was literally just some weak plastic on top of the TV got a crack in it.
Oh no, I get it. I know exactly the frustrations you can have playing those kinds of games.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on to PlayStation versus Nintendo 64.
So at this point, I just mentioned that I kind of transitioned into playing PC games. This was the absolutely PlayStation N64 and on into the subsequent console generation. I was playing PC games all the time. I didn't own or play much of these at all. But the console that I did play more of out of the two would be N64, because one of my university friends had an N64 in his room. So GoldenEye and Perfect Dark in particular got a lot of play. So yeah, N64 I guess it has to be, but no shade to the PlayStation. I just ended up playing those games on other systems later on.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, so what about your favorite console generation? Would that go back to the Super Nintendo or maybe something later when you came back to console?
The easy answer would be the Super Nintendo, but I think there's a lot of nostalgia and childhood memories wrapped up in that, which is not a bad thing, obviously. But it's really hard to look past the PS4, Xbox One, Switch generation, just because the Hitman World of Assassination trilogy is all on there. The FromSoft games, Demon's Souls original aside, they're on there with Dark Souls Remastered kind of pulling it into that generation as well. So it's really tough not to look at that. And also it's a cheats answer because those machines were heavily backwards compatible and had loads of re-releases come out in them. So there's basically nothing that I really would be desperate to play that I couldn't find a version of on those machines. So a cheats answer,
Yeah,
but I think that probably is the one.
yeah. Saying PS4 is like saying PS2, 3, and 4.
Yeah.
Saying Switch is like saying Wii U and Switch,
And
right?
a lot of Steam indie games end up on Switch as well.
Oh,
So
true.
yeah, you just end
Yeah.
up with almost everything at your fingertips.
Okay. It's acceptable. Find every loophole you can. I did with
For
Demon
sure.
Souls, remember?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have a favorite game of all time?
Depending on the day you ask me, I mean, this is going to sound like a cop out. It really isn't. It's either Dark Souls or Bloodborne, and
Okay.
you could toss either one of those up in first place depending upon how I happen to be feeling. Dark Souls for the
Amazing.
slightly more, well, for the first time it was a more open world, and that kind of level world design of looping shortcuts and stuff kind of really came into play. And for the build flexibility as well. It was really fun going and putting a character together who can, one hit take out a boss. And then Bloodborne for the atmosphere. There's nothing like that game that I've ever played, I don't think. It's astonishing for me.
Incredible. And listeners, I swear that we're two different people, and I'm not just putting on an accent to pretend that there's someone on the other side.
You
I'm
are a
giving
very
you
good
all my
actor, to
same
be fair.
answers. Thank you. Thank you. I don't think everyone knows that I've been an actor in certain times in my life.
Hello? Hey! Listen!
So, with that out of the way, let's move on to the meat. A little game that no one's ever heard of called The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. So, do you want to just give like a brief overview of what this game is for anyone who doesn't know?
It is interesting looking at Smashing Bricks and the sort of games that are picked. It's either people picking something obscure or something that is really like a stalwart of video gaming history. And yeah, there's no doubt which side this lies on. So this is the 5th, I believe, game in the Legend of Zelda franchise.
Yes.
It's to say it's a Zelda game and then just leave it at that probably does just about enough for everyone, but it's the first Zelda game that was in a 3D space. Obviously, that can be a tough term to define. I think everyone of our age knows the difference between 2D and 3D is not to do with having glasses on your face or being in VR or anything.
Oh, right.
But
Polygon-based.
And three-directional movement without being isometric or flat sort of 2D aspect. So, and broadly, I guess if we're talking genres, this is an exploration game. Given we just defined that genre, it's a third-person perspective on the character and set in a fantasy universe. Although it's fairly in terms of when you get to the bosses and the creatures and the enemies you're fighting, they are wild and wonderful, but it doesn't feel like it's necessarily high fantasy in some ways either.
Right.
But
more like fairy tale fantasy.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that is something we're bound to come back to several times. Yeah, there's like a childlike wonder to the level of sort of fantasy that's on display largely in the Zelda games. But action adventure games, leaving aside the 3D aspect, leaving aside the fantasy setting, they're action adventure games really. A lot of exploring. A lot of kind of mapping out, in some cases with the 2D games, literally having to draw maps of your environment, having a sort of an open or fairly open sort of hub world or overworld, and then diving into dungeons in different parts of the map and having to map those out and kind of figure your way through them with some sort of puzzle rooms and monster closets, I guess, to a certain extent. The door shuts behind you when you go into some of these rooms and you have to beat all the enemies to make it out. So that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it's a Zelda game. Everybody knows what a Zelda game is. And I have an interesting realization, which I'll mention in a little while. Okay, but that's our basic foundation for what the game is. But now we want to talk about what our histories were with the game. So, did you play this game when it came out growing up, or is it something you came back to later? You said that you weren't super into this generation of games.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the time when this was on the N64, absolutely not. Hadn't played this game. Definitely had heard of it, but as I say, I was playing more PC games, so it was the early days of the first-person shooter and SimCity and sports games that look more like spreadsheets and that sort of stuff on PCs. Yeah. That sort of era of Championship Manager, sort of soccer management simulation. So yeah, I completely missed this at the time. My history with Zelda in general is a bit strange, actually, in that one of the absolute games that I would point to as a favourite of all time, but certainly on the Super Nintendo, was A Link to the Past. And then I skipped everything that came after until A Link Between Worlds. So I just skipped straight to the sequel to that game, or the direct follow-up to that game. Obviously, Zelda gets a bit weird with timelines and what's a sequel to what. But yeah, so I skipped to A Link Between Worlds, and then from that on to Breath of the Wild and
another big jump.
Yeah, and those four games, I did play the remake of Link's Awakening on the Switch. In between Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, that felt like sort of just, oh, here's this little side story. For me, those four games, Link to the Past, Link Between Worlds, Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom, feel like a really neat progression of the Zelda series, even without the ones in between, which sounds ridiculous because it's like I've just skipped over the entire move to 3D. The way that the games developed in terms of combat, in terms of having wee waggle combat. I just skipped all of that. So this game in particular, I picked up the 3DS version, played through long enough. This would have been 2011, somewhere around there, when it came out. Played long enough to get out into Hyrule Field and took a look at it and thought, wow, this is a really sparse open world.
Yeah.
And literally hit Hyrule Field, started running across it and was like, oh, I'll come back to this later. And just never did at all. Just never went back to it. It was just a little bit of, I don't know, just it felt like at that point the game would have been sort of 13 years old, I guess. And it felt like, oh, I've played Nier, I may as well say it. And it felt like I played.
Say Nier?
Did someone say? Yeah, which I noticed amongst your guests, where you're getting through a fair number of the did someone say Nier?
Yeah.
Group that we had. So yeah, it was definitely a weird one where it just felt like I'd played enough of the games that took inspiration from Ocarina of Time specifically, not just Zelda in general, that it felt like it would be doing this game a disservice to judge it in that way, which is obviously nonsense, but for whatever reason I just kind of fell off playing through that version of it. And then when you asked, what game would I want to cover here, I gave you a short selection of here's some games that I did play at the time and we could go back and talk about. And here is one of the quote-unquote greatest games of all time that I haven't played, which has been the beauty of Cane and Rinse in some ways, is I've got to go back and kind of fill in the outrageous gaps that I had in my my gaming sort of knowledge and understanding and acumen.
You still missed this one.
And still missed
Amazing.
this one. Yeah, there were other people who were really keen to be on. Cane Rinse went through the whole Zelda series, and there were people who were just fans of the whole Zelda series who wanted to be on there to really dive in. And I felt like, well, I cherry picked like at that point 2 titles because this was before Breath of the Wild had come out. It didn't feel like I could try and sort of elbow my way in to talk about a game that I really can't honestly say that I was going to be a fan of or anything. So yeah, I ended up taking a back seat for that. And when I put it to you, I guess we're about to get on to your prior relationship with the game because you kind of ummed and ahed for about a minute and then said, we're doing Ocarina of Time.
Yeah, but I mean, before I say mine, just hearing what you just said, your experience makes your perspective many, many times more interesting to me than anyone who played it, on day and date of release in 1998. So I'm incredibly excited to get to that part of this. But as for me, so you have limited history. I have all the history. I got this game the day it came out. I may have pre-ordered this game, which is a rarity in my life, but I got it immediately.
Yeah.
I was looking forward to it in the months and even years leading up to its release. I was a first day Nintendo 64 owner. That was the first console that I purchased myself rather than my parents buying for me. I was in love with Super Mario 64. The transition to 3D was the most epic time in my video gaming life. And I played this game with a couple of my friends. I played it multiple times over the years, actually. But the original playthrough was a very memorable experience, spending loads of time together with my friend Mike, going through, discovering all of the new stuff that had been injected into the Zelda formula after having been a big fan of Link to the Past.
Yeah.
And the nostalgia for this game is incredible for me, which I didn't even realize until I was playing it again.
Yeah.
And certain music notes were hitting and things I was doing. I was like, wow, this is more ingrained in my soul than I thought. Because
Yeah.
I'm also not, I mean, I'm a Zelda fan, I would say, but I'm not a person who has a Triforce tattoo. I'm not a person who dresses as Link on Halloween. I don't hold Zelda as my top franchise. You know, there are a lot of people who, when it comes to Zelda, it is the be all end all, and it
Yeah.
wasn't that for me.
Hmm.
I would play all of them, and I love the majority of them, but for some reason, I don't in my brain say, oh my God, I'm the biggest Zelda fan, even
Yeah.
though I like sort of am, I guess, maybe. I've played almost all of them. When
Yeah.
the pandemic hit in 2020, I had a shoulder surgery and I had the pandemic at the same time. So I sat and I played through pretty much all of the series that I could, including this one. And I reevaluated how I felt about all of them and made like a new Zelda ranking. So, I mean, I say I'm not a big fan, but who does that, right? Um, I remember the screenshots before the game came out, the videos shown at the shows, the big anticipation, the changes as they went from tech demo to alpha to beta to adding Child Link. I remember it all. I had the
Yeah.
Nintendo Power
Yeah.
subscription. I was there. And this was a big deal for me. And I feel like it kind of laid the foundation for other games that I loved throughout history,
Yeah.
including the Souls franchise,
Yep.
which, if you think about it, it is dark grown up Zelda
Yep.
in a way.
Yeah.
And that love has carried through the years. So that's me, that's you.
Watch out!
What about the history of this game? It came out in 1998, as I said, for the Nintendo 64. November 21st in Japan, 2 days later, November 23rd in North America, and then December 11th in Europe. So it was pretty close, even though Europe got the traditional later date.
And I think in this case, looking at the dates, I think there's a very clear reason why. I think, obviously, it comes out in Japan first. I think they probably busted a gut to get it out just in time for Thanksgiving in North America.
Hmm.
And I think they didn't.
Yeah.
They therefore said Europe gets it for Christmas because there's nothing special about the end of November in Europe. It's just the end of a month. You know,
It was a logistical decision.
I think yeah, it could well have been, but yeah, this is a fairly modest delay, like a delay of
Yeah.
less than 3 weeks, 2.5 weeks, something like that.
But maybe enough to focus on the first shipping container.
Yeah, exactly.
And then
Yeah,
the second
yeah,
shipping
yeah.
container.
And I'm fairly sure Nintendo 64 cartridge production was not ever a smooth thing, so it wouldn't surprise me if that's what they did. They shipped them all off to North America as soon as they'd met Japanese sort of demand and got as many there as possible for Thanksgiving weekend.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Good insight. We know this was made by Nintendo. It was Nintendo EAD, which was formerly R&D4 in the NES era, aka Miyamoto's team, right? He was the producer on this game. And this was before he became an even bigger shot than he already was at the company, because he was promoted to the board of directors in 2000, where he would eventually oversee literally everything that Nintendo made. Here, he remained a producer in charge of this game.
Yeah.
Another change was that he wasn't the director on this game, but had 5 directors working under him that he led. And that was Eiji Onuma, probably can't say any of these names right, Yoshiaki Koizumi, Toru Osawa, Yoichi Yamada, and Toshio Iwawaki. Now, all these people, if you don't recognize all their names, maybe you recognize some, but we know Aonuma went on to lead the Zelda team since then. He's worked on nothing but Zelda since then. Koizumi had worked on Link to the Past, Link's Awakening, Super Mario Kart, Super Mario World, and Super Mario 64. And after he did this game and Majora's Mask, he then went mostly back to Mario for the rest of time. Yamada has worked on nearly every Zelda game since Link to the Past, including supervising the Capcom ones on the Game Boy, as well as some Star Fox games, Super Mario 64, and Wave Race 64. And he was the game system director on Ocarina of Time. Iwawaki was a programmer on Mario 2 through 64 and on most Zelda games since Link to the Past, and was the programming director on Ocarina of Time. And Osawa had created Kid Icarus and was the script director and sort of the coordinator between directors on Ocarina of Time. Now, this was a shift for Nintendo.
Yeah.
Prior to this, and I guess prior to 3D development might have been the change, was there was a game director. And it was like the vision of that one person on how to direct the game. But here, they kind of divided game development into departments, with Miyamoto kind of being the glue between them. And I think
we've seen this sort of thing at particular pivotal moments. I know Nintendo went through a lot of growing pains when they had to move into HD development, where suddenly they needed to increase their art studios massively, and it wasn't something they'd had to encounter as early as Microsoft and Sony and companies making games for their consoles had. And this strikes me as a situation where, you look at this game and it's like, one person kind of can't handle all this. We need the technical expertise in each department to be prioritized. And so, I guess that's why you break it out into 5 different departments. So you can split up sort of gameplay and graphics and combat and, the kind of mechanical side, keep it separate almost from the artistic side.
Yeah. And I think this is one of many influences or foundational elements of game design that Nintendo and Ocarina of Time sort of put into motion early on, that was then taken as the way to do it going forward. Because that's how all games are made now, is multiple departments, kind of separate, kind of working together, especially now. Now teams are gigantic.
I think the other thing here is that obviously these 5 directors have all got such a storied history in Nintendo, but just taking a moment to realize that if you were someone who was at Nintendo at this point, probably you stayed there for an awfully long time, and your CV, your gameography, however we want to describe it, is just, it's unreal. Like this is not, even someone at Naughty Dog who's got that list of games on their CV. In this case, these games were coming out often like a couple of years apart, and it was just genre-defining game after genre-defining game that these people have got on their CV. It's immense. It really is.
Yeah, and then of course we have on the music, we have the legendary Koji Kondo.
Yeah.
Writers Kensuke Tanabe and one of the directors, Osawa, was the script director, and Tanabe was the writer on Link to the Past and Link's Awakening. So again, lots of experience in there, and all these people went on to do great things. So the beginnings of this game followed the longest gap between Zelda games ever, ironically, after what you just said about how rapidly sometimes games were being produced.
Yeah.
Because from Link's Awakening to Ocarina of Time was 5 years. Or if we're talking home console entries, Link to the Past was 1991. So this had a really long development cycle. And there's a reason for that, because it was the new console, the new way of making games, and a little bit of failed hardware thrown in just to make it interesting.
Yeah.
So the original idea for a 3D Zelda actually began on the Super Nintendo, because remember, Nintendo was making games with that FX chip on some of the cartridges, like Star Fox
in particular, yeah.
Yeah, so Miyamoto and Koizumi wanted to make a sword fighting based sort of Zelda 2 like game using that technology. And much later, recently actually, we've seen the leaks of the original pile of polygons that were supposed to be the shape of Link. I don't know if you've seen those pictures.
No, I haven't. No.
Oh man, it's just a bunch of triangles basically not touching each other but just arranged in sort of the shape of a person. And that was the beginning idea for 3D Zelda, but that was abandoned pretty quickly because Nintendo was on the cusp of the Nintendo 64, Project Reality announced in 1994. So that's pretty soon after Link to the Past. But what did survive was the focus on combat. And as we know, Ocarina of Time did develop a whole new combat system that was very different than just tapping your B button on previous Zelda games. We had that Z targeting. Was this the first time we ever saw Z targeting or something like that, targeting in combat?
I'm trying to think. I mean, I guess 3D games kind of demanded that because you had to suddenly consider that where the player was looking was significant, and you couldn't always know that. When you've got a fixed sort of 2D frame, you kind of know what the player has to look at on the screen, and they can choose what they are interacting with based on their movement. Whereas when you're in a 3D environment, you've got movement, but also where the player is looking, and you kind of need to treat those things almost separately. So yeah, I guess you needed some way of targeting in order to make sense of it, so the player wasn't fighting the camera quite so much. And they didn't have a pre-established sort of convention to build off of at that point, at the start of development, certainly.
Right. Yeah, so what they created from this development, which was partially concurrent with Mario 64 actually, and also used a lot of the same engine as Mario 64, was they added this Z targeting system where you put a marker on your enemy, it locks on, and then you can circle them. And this was also based off of those samurai films, samurai cinema,
Yeah.
Chanbara, I think it's called. And that's what they wanted to recreate. And seems like it worked because, well, we'll get to that. But this is also where one of our favorite people in the world came from, and that is the fairy navigation system, which was a way to link this mechanism to the lore of the game.
Hello.
Navigation fairy, Navi the fairy. And we'll talk about her some more later.
It's such a Nintendo thing to personify a game mechanic like that. I think of Ring Fit, where the ring has to be a character in the game and not just something you're kind of holding in your hands to exercise with. But yeah,
oh my god, Navi I didn't even know that.
Oh yeah, it's a character in the game. Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, Navi the fairy and Crosshair the elf or something. It's just
yeah, exactly. Crosshair. Okay, so first time it was ever shown. I remember this, as I said, 1995 Space World, or aka the Shoshinkai Show, which was Nintendo's own convention in Japan. First screenshots came out of here, first video. There was a pointy nose Link and a completely featureless silver metallic knight. They were very blocky. They almost disappeared at the joints, and they had a little sword fight with sparks flying, which were just streaks on the screen between them in a dark background with basically nothing happening. So that's when it was shown, and they said, The Legend of Zelda 64 is coming to the 64DD, the Nintendo 64 disk drive, which will be an expansion hardware to our as of yet unreleased Nintendo Ultra 64. It was amazing. That was the plan. They had this arc, right, to release the console, but have already announced the Zelda for the addition to the unreleased console.
Was this purely because PlayStation was going disc-based and therefore they kind of assumed they would need to do that to make this game kind of work? I wonder.
I think they were thinking about the capacity of the media as well as the ability to have the player influence the world and have that be saved. That was always a huge part of of the sale of the 64DD, the marketing of it was anything that you do will change what happens in these games. They said that about this, they said that about Earthbound 64,
Yeah.
and whatever few games that were mentioned at the time of the 64DD. But they found that it wasn't going to work for them because of the media. Again, it was magnetic disc media, which meant it was slow to read,
Yeah.
slow access, so it couldn't work in this action-packed game. But at this time, they were kind of working on this combat. They were also finishing up Mario 64. Mario 64 is done in 1996, so all hands on deck for Zelda. And then in Space World 96, we get the first real Zelda footage that actually looks a lot more like the final game as opposed to a weird tech demo. Link's there, the Triforce is there, he's fighting a skeleton. It's in Nintendo Power. I'm looking at the screenshots on the floor with my magazine open, getting ultra hyped.
Yeah.
We see that they only had 2 buttons on screen, the A and the B button, which we know later we got up to 5 buttons on the screen for actions and items. And that was it. That was the first thing that was shown as far as what looked close to the final game. So you don't remember any of that at all.
No, not at all. I mean, it's just remarkable to look back. Obviously, that's nearly 30 years ago now, but just the way that information came out about games, simultaneously, some stuff would come out like demos or ideas or screenshots that would never be shown these days. Like, until you've got something that they are sure is going to impress, they would never put something out nowadays. But also, you would also get so much more nowadays, and you'd have all of the sort of PR beats laid out in front of you to make sure that your hype was building exactly as, and in this case it was just you grabbed hold of anything you could that would tell you something about this game, that your imagination was running away with ideas of what it might be, and every little screenshot, every little sort of paragraph written about it, and the idea of getting to see a short video clip as a demo or anything like that back then would have just been completely alien to me. I bought the odd gaming magazine, and that's where I got any idea of what games were coming out from.
Yeah, that is incredible. It's like whatever we're up to, someone comes in and says, "Can we get some screenshots? Can we send something over to the magazine?"
Yeah.
Wherever you're at, just give us a few. Give us a video. We'll take that. We'll send it out there, whatever it is, as opposed to planning. This is only for the commercial. This is only for the time-released YouTube video on the day and date that we want to release it to build hype. Yeah, it's amazing how different things are now. So this game, as I said, it was concurrent with Super Mario 64 at the beginning, and that means that the engine was actually the same engine at first until it got modified and modified and modified. And one of the key distinctions was the camera, where in Mario 64, you're controlling the camera every step of the way. You're moving it, positioning it so that you're looking at Mario, you're doing the Mario things.
Yeah.
For Zelda, there was a change in philosophy where Miyamoto wanted this to be about Hyrule, about the world, and also wanted the player to have to do less and let the game sort of take care of that. And we saw that with the new camera system where you don't control it except for when you press the Z button. And we also saw that with some automatic jumping and context-sensitive actions. And that was a philosophy that changed the direction of this game. And they wanted it to actually be easier overall and more accessible than Mario, despite its darker tone versus the more cheerful Mario. This kind of directed their development process. And on the same note, the plans for the structure of the game at this early time were much more similar to Super Mario 64. Early ideas were to have a hub world like Super Mario 64, actually in a castle, and actually with paintings in Ganon's castle, leading to discrete and separate areas like levels. And only later did it turn into an open world design. And we actually see some of that original intent surviving in the final game when we're in a sort of castle area and we have someone going in and out of paintings.
Yeah. Yeah.
The fight with Ganondorf, the Phantom Ganondorf fight, that
And
actually survives from this early point.
yeah, outside of that, there's some paintings where there are other creatures coming out of elsewhere in the castle as well. So yeah, that really played through. I can't imagine this game in that way. Like I'm sure they would have made it a fantastic game nonetheless, but this game without open world is not this game at all.
Yeah.
Like to the point where it kind of blows me away how excited people were for Breath of the Wild on the basis of that initial like trailer we got that hinted at it being open world, and it was like, oh, open world Zelda. And it's like, this was open world Zelda, certainly in as much as Dark Souls was. And I suppose people did the same with Elden Ring. It was like, oh, open worlds FromSoft. It's like, well, Dark Souls more or less is. You can more or less go wherever you want. And
like, how are you defining open world, my friend?
Yeah.
You can
Yeah,
go
absolutely.
anywhere that's accessible.
Yeah.
It's not disjointed. It's not levels. It's not like, okay, now you're in 1-1. Now you're in 1-2. It was open world, and Zelda's always been open world from the very beginning.
Yeah, absolutely.
So to make this one not open world would have simply been a concession to the restrictions of the hardware, not having the memory on the cartridge.
Yeah.
But they didn't have to make those restrictions. They actually moved the game from the 64DD at this point in 97 and said, we're putting it on the largest cartridge ever made. It was originally planned to be a whopping 16 megabytes. I can't believe these things when they come up. And ultimately, it wound up being a gigantic, never before seen 32 megabyte cartridge.
I think I sneezed more than 32 megabytes.
I know. I can't fathom that playing through this multiple dozens of hours long game is 32 megabytes. Megabytes. Yeah. Like even a 32 gigabyte card for my camera, I feel like it's a little small.
Yeah.
And that's just
absolutely. Yeah.
That's just the card that goes into my camera.
Yeah, I've got a 128 gigabyte USB memory stick on my keyring, just to have it there in case I need it when I'm out and about.
Just in case.
Yeah.
Just in case I need to transfer some small files between computers. It's incredible.
Yeah.
So came to the 64. They officially decided it's coming to the 64 and not the 64DD because the 64DD had this slow magnetic storage media, which had great capacity, but was not going to give them the action and pace that they wanted for a game that was originally focused around a combat system to emulate samurai, right? So at this point, while Navi being introduced was pushing the expansion of all the narrative elements of the game, just the fact that they put Navi in as the fairy, they decided, oh, well, Link, I guess, is a Kokiri boy. He lives in the forest. They all have fairies. There are fairy items. There's a fairy ocarina. That was all guided by the fact that Navi was added. And at the same time, the loss of the disk space on the DD back down to the Nintendo 64 cartridges was shrinking all of the game's maps that they had planned. It was limiting the textures that they could add. It forced the interiors in a lot of the buildings to go from full 3D to pre-rendered, static images, and have these overhead views that just seemed a little out of place. Or the entire Castletown area being a pre-rendered area.
Yeah, that's the one that stands out to me. Is you go into through the drawbridge and immediately you're on a isometric perspective to run across that stretch. No need for it, or it stands out. I guess there obviously was a need for it.
There was absolutely a need for it.
Yeah,
they probably just figured, well, where's the area that we have the least interactive and important stuff?
There's one door and one guard. That's fine. It can just be isometric.
What would be a good area where we could just put a bunch of buildings, and then when you go through those doors, those are your discrete areas that we can render separately. Well, it's a Castletown because it has these stores. And I never knew that until this podcast. And it
Yep.
makes a lot of sense
Yeah.
because those things do feel out of place.
Yeah, definitely.
Also, at this point, we changed the story of this game to a prequel, whereas originally it was meant to be after Zelda 2. The Ocarina was introduced, and that was going to be a tool to unlock a realm where the Triforce was held, a lot like Link to the Past and the Mirror. And then it was later changed to Traveling Through Time, which we ultimately got. Child Link was only introduced at this point 2 years into development, a year before release.
Wow.
The name was only given at this time, Space World, 1 year before release in November 97. And there were finally demos of the game. The next year, they said, you know what? We are going to make a Zelda Ocarina of Time game for the 64DD. It's going to be called Ura Zelda, and it's going to be a revised and reworked sort of second quest version of Ocarina of Time. Just
They
to, just to
really
complicate
wanted,
things a little more.
yeah, they really wanted this to work, didn't they?
Yeah, well, they wanted a killer app for the 64DD, I think,
Yeah.
which, I mean, they were trying. I was so hyped for the 64DD. I
Really?
was never
Yeah.
more excited than for the Nintendo 64 and the 64DD. Probably more for the 64 and
Yeah.
less for the DD, but I was super hyped. I remember looking at every picture of every game that was planned for the 64DD, all 5 of them, and and just being really excited because it was for my favorite console. It was going to expand it. It was going to be great. Never happened. So yeah, we had that announcement that Ura Zelda was going to be a thing, and then in just the last 2 to 3 months before release, Miyamoto was still requesting numerous tweaks and changes to cutscenes. A whole in-based mechanic was eliminated and replaced by an ocarina song. Zora's domain was reconfigured. Areas were removed. A sword ability was removed. Right up to the end. And that whole cutscene thing, that was only possible because they did everything in this game in all real time. There's no FMVs, no pre-rendered
Yeah.
videos, so they could change whatever they wanted by operating in these real-time scenes, which ended up being really cinematic. That was a goal of theirs, was to make a cinematic game, but that it was still a game, that you didn't watch a movie, because Miyamoto saw that in other developers and he didn't really like that. He still wanted to make games, and he thought that
Yeah.
people were wanting to make movies but call them games.
Well, particularly in the early disc era, part of the big thing there was you could stream audio and video from the disc and make it look much more cinematic. But then you ended up with this disparity between what the gameplay looked like and what the cutscene looked like, because they were two completely different things in some cases.
Yeah, I remember that in the early days, and they would often show the FMVs and not show the real-time gameplay
Yep.
footage.
Yeah, it was
And then you'd be
box
like,
art of its
whoa,
day,
this
wasn't
isn't
it?
what
Yeah.
you showed.
This isn't real. Yeah.
That's crazy. But that gave them a lot of flexibility, and it let
Yeah.
them kind of complete the vision of what they were looking for right down to those last couple months.
Yeah.
And then, after the game was released, shortly after, they announced, well, we're going to make another Zelda game just like this one, and we're going to do it fast and soon, and you will have Zelda Gaiden in about a year. But that's a whole other story from Majora's Mask.
Listen.
Okay. So what about sales? What can you tell us about sales of this game?
The sales were pretty darn good. I remember hearing you talk to Sadie about Mario Sunshine, and that you kind of need to recalibrate your expectations based on what sales would have been 20, 30 years ago. And yeah, pre-orders. So in the case of successful games, talking about hundreds of thousands of sales in the first sort of week or two, 500,000 pre-orders in the US, 1,000,000 in less than a week. I mean, these numbers just are almost, I'm gonna say unheard of at this time. It just didn't happen that one game kind of captured this much attention this quickly. Certainly, something like Myst which was the biggest selling PC game for years after its release. That built slowly, though. It wasn't like out of the gate selling millions of copies. It was as each kind of beat of it getting cultural awareness happened. Whereas this, the anticipation for this is there in the sales numbers, isn't it?
Yeah, just to put it in perspective with that comparison, Myst sold 500,000 in the first year.
Yeah.
I just happen to have that number because we already covered that game.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
and that was a big deal.
Yeah.
And it was around
huge.
the same time. I mean, it was a little bit earlier. Myst was a little bit earlier.
A few
but
years.
still.
Yeah, it was 94, wasn't it? So yeah, 1 million in less than a week, 2.5 in the first month. So I mean, that's just the anticipation's there. And then it wasn't like it was only the people who were looking forward to this game who'd already pre-ordered it, and everyone else was nonplussed. It just kept going.
5 times the number of people.
Yeah, exactly. That's a huge deal. It really is. And obviously, the first month is kind of end of November through Christmas period. That's when you're going to see the biggest amount of sales. But it's also only the last sort of 5-6 weeks of the year, and it just gangbusters is a term that was made for sales like this.
Mm-hmm.
So
in just those last few weeks, it was still the best-selling game of that year in the United States.
Yeah,
it's nuts.
Yeah. And that sort of thing, I don't think these days that really happens, unless you're talking like a Grand Theft Auto. But even then, that tends to be sales going on over a number of years that stays in sales charts and stuff. In this case, just to blitz in a few weeks what other games had tried to sell over the whole year. And yeah, a year later, 7 million units, so it didn't even slow down then, really. Obviously, week to week it slowed down, but it's still to be nearly tripling what your first month sales were in your first year is quite something. And this is one of the games where, you talk about the oft said thing by sort of the late 2000s was video games are bigger than music and movies combined. And it's games like this that make that the case. After a year grossing $400 million worth of sales with just one version of it, that's not a multi-platform game. That's a huge amount of money, especially for back then. And part of the reason why games were as big as they were then and only got bigger.
Yeah, and you mentioned film. This out-earned any movie at the end of 1998.
Yeah.
Killer. And 1998 was not a slouch of a year for video games either to be the best-selling game of the U.S.
Yeah.
This N64 version, it ultimately sold 7.6 million copies, just the N64 version. And it was released on every single platform Nintendo ever made since then, in the virtual consoles and the remake on the 3DS and blah 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 beep bop boop. So those aren't even in these numbers.
No.
But as for 1998 and what was out at that time, you had great games that it was going up against.
Big year for games, yeah.
You just had GoldenEye the previous year and Super Mario 64 the year before that on the Nintendo 64. But then in 1998, you had games like Banjo-Kazooie and F-Zero X on that console. The PlayStation had Metal Gear Solid, had Resident Evil 2, had Xenogears. The PC had StarCraft, Grim Fandango, Half-Life. 2 days before Zelda came out, Half-Life came out in the US. Actually, the same day in Japan.
Yeah.
And as far as, this was what I was going to say earlier, I realized in looking into this game and its history, Zelda doesn't really have a true rival franchise, right? There's no Sonic to Mario for Zelda.
No,
and
absolutely.
The closest thing I could think of, and not even because it's the same genre or the same type of game, was the Final Fantasy franchise, because of how it's long running. It has so many entries and it has a big fan base.
And some weird kind of timeline things as well. It's not all based around one set of characters, anything like that. So it definitely has some weirdness there.
Yeah, and this was wedged right between FF7 and FF8, 97 and 99.
But even when you think of this series, Zelda series legacy, Stuff like Okami, Darksiders, Nier, Immortals Phoenix Rising, Tunic, I guess. There's loads
Mm-hmm.
and loads of kind of homages or spiritual successors or contemporaries for the series, but nothing that spawns any kind of lasting series like Zelda has. All of those I've
Yeah.
mentioned were either one-offs or with Darksiders have kind of morphed between various different sorts of games and now I guess probably sputtered out Darksiders. But
Mm-hmm.
everything else, they take inspiration and they make the game that lives up to hopefully something like Ocarina of Time, in the case of like Okami and Darksiders in particular. But then it doesn't really go anywhere. They don't have the momentum. And I guess if I'm being potentially critical about it, they don't have the willingness to use their imagination for what those games could be. Zelda, for all its formulaic, the sort of criticisms of it being formulaic that are laid at its feet, in terms of, oh, it's a dungeon, you go here, you get a tool, you use it in the dungeon, and then you move on. It shows all of that Nintendo ingenuity. The innovation that goes on between one game to the next, between one dungeon to the next, between one room to the next is there. And I think that's where other games don't capitalize on that by switching things up enough and making things different enough.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just amazing that it's gone so long without anyone else kind of getting into the game long term. And I think you're right. It's because they can't squeeze as much out of it as Nintendo has been able to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's incredible. And for that reason, this game was pretty well received. They squeezed enough out of it to get some nice review scores. What do we know about how Ocarina of Time was reviewed over the years?
So I still can't quite get my head around this because a Famitsu 40 out of 40 nowadays is a weird thing. But back then, a Famitsu 40 out of 40 had literally never been seen before. Part of the thing of that is
Right.
they have 4 different reviewers. Each reviews the game, they combine the score. So you have to get 4 different reviewers all agreeing that the game deserves a 10 out of 10. Now, when we see an IGN 10 out of 10, the caveat is always there. This is the reviewer's opinion. And then the people who edited and helped bring that review to the forefront, they didn't necessarily agree, but they wanted to bring forward that reviewer's perspective. It's why you end up with Game of the Year debates every year, where you have fairly intense discussions between people who all love games, but all love them in slightly different ways. And so a 40 out of 40 from Famitsu at that point in 1998 was literally unheard of and almost unfathomable. I think, thinking back on it now, obviously at the time I didn't know what that was, but thinking about it now and the kind of legacy of that, an Edge magazine 10 out of 10 at the time, again, that was something really, really special. Not to say that it isn't now, but obviously over time, more and more games get added to that list. Yeah, it really is something quite special and is still atop the Metacritic all-time rankings. I think this game still sits atop that. Yeah,
I checked that and I was surprised. I thought it would have been, bumped down with like retro reviews or whatever, and other games may have come along and gone ahead of it, but nope, there it was, right at the top. With a higher number than I remember. I always thought it was at a 98, but it's at a 99 of 100 on Metacritic. And it was at a 98 out of 100 when Game Rankings was still in publication.
Still around, yeah.
It also won every Game of the Year award back then. I'm pretty sure it just clean swept every publication. I just didn't even want to list them. Also, greatest game of all time lists. At least 20 major publications have listed this as the greatest game of all time over the years. And even now, if you just search like best games of all time, you'll still find it either at the top or near the top. And only in the last few years have we finally seen it sort of slipping down on a lot of the more modern lists. But it's never not in the conversation.
Yeah, but that's attrition over time, isn't it? Memories fade.
Yeah.
The age of the people contributing to those sorts of things at different publications gradually doesn't shift younger, but it's some people age out of that, move away, and it's an incredibly tough thing to imagine. Some films definitely stay there, but something that is as quickly technologically advancing as video games, the notion that there's a game that many games from that era can't be played today, like you really have to go out of your way to play them, as you absolutely will have experienced with this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, even just to look at the other games that came out in that year, there are all timers in that list. RE2, Metal Gear Solid,
Mm-hmm.
StarCraft, Half-Life. Those are absolutely games that would end up on greatest of all time lists. And yet this one still, I think, has to, whether it is for each person personally or not, I think probably still has to be listed as above, atop that pile of games, just because of
Mm-hmm.
the acclaim it got at the time, but the sustained acclaim. It's still a game that is kind of, its name is mentioned in hushed tones almost. It really is.
Yeah.
There's a reverence for it that it's specifically about that game. In this case, it's about what this meant for Zelda games, what it meant for Nintendo, what it meant for 3D games. This is a different thing to a Mario 64 in terms of 3D games. It's an action adventure for a reason. It's a huge thing. It really is, this game. It's
Mm-hmm.
to advance the technology and to provide a game that is probably 30 hours worth of gameplay, depending upon how much you're trying to do of it. And even then, like, there's bits of the game you're just not going to see unless you've got a guide next to you or a friend telling you a secret about it or whatever it might be. It's a huge, almost unfathomable achievement in this game, I have to say.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned like people are kind of aging out of the memories of it,
Yeah.
but at the same time, some people are not. And we
Yeah.
have this really interesting thing that happened just last year. It's called Ship of Harkinian, which was a group that fully decompiled the original game into readable C programming language and then created a source port for all the different computer platforms and made it even playable on the Wii U and Switch with all updated graphics, and they can add stuff and whatever, and it's like this whole new version of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina
Yeah.
of Time, and it's only done because of how revered this is.
Yeah.
And if you're wondering what Ship of Harkinian even means, it's a reference to King Harkinian from the CDI games and the cartoon, and the Ship of Theseus concept, where if you have a ship and you gradually replace all parts of the ship, is it the original ship anymore,
Yeah.
or is it a new ship? And that's a thing that anyone can get.
Yeah. And what a fitting name for taking a game apart and then rebuilding it all over again with essentially all new parts, but still being, the same thing.
Yeah. And that doesn't happen without this reverence.
No, absolutely not. And I think another game that's on there. So Half-Life is a game that has been modded and updated and fan project to within an inch of its life to try and keep it the way that people remember it. Because, as with this game, it's probably not the way that people remember it. It probably is a little more blocky, a little tougher to control, depending upon the controller you're using, than people remember it being. But the difference between this and Half-Life is Half-Life was on PC. That makes it infinitely more accessible to modders. Games that are not, it may be possible to emulate a game without being able to actually access its source code and to be able to then reproduce that and to have to rebuild it brick by brick because you can't just parse it all out easily from console file. So yeah, that's a heck of a project to have undertaken. And yeah, as you say, you don't do that unless you really want to. It's not something you undertake lightly.
Yeah. So that's the general opinion about the game, right? But that leads us to people who just played it, to people who are revisiting it however many years later. What year is it? 23 years?
5.
5 years later?
Yeah, this month, yeah.
Yeah. So, we played it. How'd it go for you? This is my most exciting moment, is to hear from the Ocarina of Time newbie how it went. No, you haven't been sealed in the sacred realm, but you have reached the end of part 1 of this podcast of time, the past. Look for part 2 coming right up wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Eddie Inzauto, talking with James Carter about The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time.